It's an honor to be here and share some thoughts with you about this big project that I've been working on.
At 11:42 a.m., just minutes before he was murdered, Dan Marel received a phone call from his ex-wife, Wendy. Was it a final taunt, a distraction, or the signal for his killers to strike? Dan's death wasn't a random act of violence. It was a hit, orchestrated with precision.
Well, we talked about it many times before it actually happened, but when the separation became official, he was very upset.
The shooters, Luis Rivera and Sigfredo Garcia, were hired guns, but the mastermind, that was Wendy, a woman so consumed by rage, she paid to have her children's father killed. This is the story of how a divorce turned deadly and how a mother's vengeance destroyed a family forever. Background on Dan Marel. Dan Marel's life was a story of success, intellect, and dedication. Born and raised in Toronto, Canada, he was a young man destined for greatness. A prodigy from an early age, Marel had an innate ability for law and philosophy, and he pursued these passions relentlessly. His academic journey took him to some of the most prestigious institutions in the world, the University of Jerusalem for his undergraduate studies and Harvard Law School for his graduate education. After completing his law degree, he clerked for Judge Michael Daley Hawkins and worked at top law firms in Washington, D.C., defending high-profile white-collar criminals. Marel's talents didn't just lie in his academic and professional achievements. He was also a beloved figure in the academic world. In 2005, he accepted a position at Florida State University College of Law. His expertise in criminal law quickly made him a treasured faculty member. Marel authored several books on criminal law and gained tenure by 2010. His colleagues regarded him as a brilliant legal mind, and his students admired his dedication to teaching and passion for the subject. However, despite his success, Marel's personal life was far less stable. In 2006, while working at FSU, Marel met Wendy Adon on an online dating service, JDate. Wendy, with a background of her own, seemed like the perfect match. The two married quickly and soon had 2 children. They settled into a comfortable life in Tallahassee, Florida, where Marel continued to thrive professionally at the university. On the surface, it appeared that Marel had everything: a respected career, a beautiful family, and a quiet life in a well-to-do neighborhood. But, like many couples, their relationship began to strain under the weight of time and personal differences. By 2009, their marriage was no longer the picture of harmony it had once been. Marel authored a paper titled Privilege or Punish: Criminal Justice and the Challenge of Family Ties, which, on the surface, appeared to be a typical academic piece. However, those who knew Marel personally speculated that it reflected the growing tensions he was facing in his own family life. The paper touched on the intersection of personal and professional lives in criminal justice, and it seemed that Marel was grappling with personal issues that were spilling over into his academic work. In 2012, Marel's life took a drastic turn when his marriage to Wendy ended. The divorce was anything but amicable, and Marel described it as a Pearl Harbor-style attack on his life. The separation was bitter, with Marel fighting hard for custody of his children. Wendy, however, made it clear that she wanted nothing more to do with him. When Dan returned home from a business trip in September 2012, he found his home empty. His furniture was gone, the children had been taken, and the only thing left was a mattress on the floor and the divorce papers. In the aftermath of the divorce, Wendy changed the children's last name from Marel to Adon and went so far as to change their first names. It was clear that she wanted to sever all ties to Dan, and this act was the beginning of a long and bitter legal and emotional struggle between them. Dan fought for custody of the children, which only seemed to exacerbate the tensions between the two. Their divorce became increasingly acrimonious, and Dan described it as a Visigoth-like sacking of the marital home. While Dan focused on his career, his personal life spiraled into chaos. Wendy's actions seemed to be motivated by a desire to erase Dan from her life and their children's lives. This emotional and legal battle would soon escalate into something much darker. Wendy's decision to sever all ties and her attempts to control the children's future became the catalyst for a tragic event, one that would lead to Dan's untimely death. What started as a seemingly routine divorce had now turned into a full-blown custody and financial dispute, with the specter of revenge hanging heavily over both of their lives. The emotional and legal toll of their marriage and divorce created a breeding ground for resentment, and it would be this bitterness that ultimately led to the crime that shocked the community. Dan Marel's life, once marked by success and stability, was now overshadowed by an explosive and devastating conflict that would culminate in his murder just a few years later. The murder. On the morning of July 18, 2014, Dan Marel's life came to a violent end.
Dan's life was brought to a sudden, abrupt, and tragic end when he was murdered in July 2014.
And with it, a series of events set in motion by years of family tension, custody disputes, and personal betrayal would culminate in an explosive and tragic conclusion. It was a typical sunny morning in Tallahassee when Marel's neighbor, James Geiger, heard a sharp sound that he initially thought was a car backing out of the driveway. However, as he stepped outside to check, he realized something wasn't right. The garage door of Marel's home was up, and a silver sedan was parked in the driveway running. As Geiger walked closer to the vehicle, he saw Marel slumped over in the driver's seat, blood pooling from a head wound. The car's driver's side window had been shattered, and Marel was unresponsive. His injuries were severe, but there was still a glimmer of life left in him, though it was unclear whether he had been shot or if he had possibly shot himself. Geiger immediately dialed 911, his voice urgent and filled with distress as he explained that there had been a shooting. As he described the scene, he mentioned the car still running and the shattered window, giving officers an early indication that something far more serious than a typical break-in was taking place. His description made it clear that Marel was badly hurt, and the urgency of his call was clear. He's not responding, he needs help. Responding to the scene, Sergeant David Sims quickly assessed the situation. Marel was still alive but severely injured, with blood covering his face and his body slumped forward. Sims noticed that Marel's personal effects, his cell phone and business card, were scattered in the front seat, and his eyeglasses had fallen to the floor. Marel was clinging to life, but it was clear that he had been shot. It was a strange scene. No valuables had been stolen, and no apparent motive for a robbery was evident. The absence of any attempt to rob Marel, coupled with the violent nature of the attack, suggested that this was a targeted murder. Marel was rushed to the hospital, but despite the best efforts of medical professionals, he died early the following morning. The cause of death was later confirmed to be gunshot wounds to the head. The investigation into his death quickly transitioned from a routine shooting to a homicide investigation, with the police considering the possibility that this was not a random act of violence, but a premeditated murder. As the investigators began to piece together Marel's life, they uncovered the complexities of his relationships, particularly his bitter divorce from Wendy Adon, the emotional and legal turmoil surrounding his custody battle for his children, and the hostility between him and Wendy pointed to a deeply fractured family dynamic. But this was only part of the picture. There was something more, something darker that needed to be uncovered. The police began by questioning Marel's ex-wife, Wendy, who had left their home years earlier under bitter circumstances. Initially, Wendy had no idea about the shooting, only learning about it from her realtor. Upon hearing the news, Wendy's reaction seemed surprisingly calm. She expressed shock but appeared emotionally detached from the event. Wendy was questioned at length, and during the interrogation, inconsistencies began to surface. She claimed to have been home working on a paper for school and doing laundry at the time of the shooting. Yet her timeline seemed unconvincing. Her alibi was full of gaps, and a crucial detail soon came to light. Wendy had called Dan just minutes before the shooting took place. This phone call was a key turning point in the investigation, casting a shadow of suspicion over Wendy. While it was initially unclear whether Wendy had any direct involvement in her ex-husband's death, investigators quickly began to suspect that the crime had been carefully orchestrated by someone close to Marel. A murder for hire seemed to be the most likely theory, as the police uncovered more details about the financial motives and the family tensions that had been brewing for years. Marel's murder was no random act of violence. It was an execution, planned with precision and fueled by personal vendettas. With Wendy's behavior becoming increasingly suspicious, detectives expanded their investigation into the possibility that someone from her circle may have been involved in carrying out the murder. Was it just a botched robbery, or had Marel been deliberately targeted by his own family? The investigation was only beginning to uncover the full scope of the conspiracy that had led to his tragic death. Wendy Adon's interrogation. After Dan Marel's death, Wendy Adon was summoned for questioning by the authorities. Although initially calm, Wendy's behavior during the interrogation began to raise alarms for the detectives. Her reaction to the news of Marel's death seemed too controlled, almost detached. She wasn't visibly shaken, nor did she express the profound grief that would be expected from someone in her position, particularly given the messy divorce and custody battle that had dominated their relationship in the years before the murder.
Well, we talked about it many times before it actually happened, but when the separation became official, he was very upset.
Wendy's story during the interrogation was consistent with the initial reports she had given to the police, but there were glaring inconsistencies that stood out. She claimed that she had spent the morning working on a paper for school, emailing a librarian for help with citations, and then doing household chores. Wendy said that after finishing her work, she went to a liquor store around noon to buy supplies for a party. But when detectives questioned her about her activities more thoroughly, her responses began to show cracks. She seemed overly rehearsed, as if she had prepared herself for questions. But there were small details that didn't add up. The most suspicious part of the interrogation came when Wendy was asked about her phone call history. When shown the records, she immediately became nervous and hesitant, especially when detectives pointed out that she had called Dan Marel shortly before his death. Wendy's response was unsettling. She had called him at 11:42 a.m., just minutes before the shooting occurred. This was a critical moment in the interrogation. Why would she call him so close to the time of his murder, and what could have been the purpose of the call? Her explanation seemed unconvincing, and it was clear to detectives that she had been less than forthcoming. Further probing revealed even more troubling details. Wendy mentioned in passing that she had driven by her old house on Trescott Drive that morning, a detail that seemed completely out of place. Why would Wendy, who had been so determined to sever ties with Marel after their divorce, suddenly return to her old home? She claimed that she drove past the house to come to terms with the divorce, but this seemed highly suspicious. This was a woman who had fought bitterly to break free from Marel, and who had even gone so far as to change their children's names. Yet now, after years of erasing him from her life, she was revisiting the place that had caused so much emotional pain. The detectives were not convinced by Wendy's explanations. They knew that people often have a tendency to over-explain when they're hiding something, and Wendy's attempts to justify her actions only added fuel to their suspicions. Her emotional detachment, combined with the shaky alibi and inconsistent statements, painted a picture of a woman who had something to hide. The situation worsened for Wendy when detectives began to focus on her recent communications with other people. When asked about her family's involvement in the situation, Wendy was quick to deny any knowledge or connection to the crime. However, her body language betrayed her. At one point, when the detectives pressed her about any financial dealings or family members who might have had a motive, Wendy's demeanor changed. She became more defensive, and it was clear that she was uncomfortable with the direction the interrogation was taking. The detectives' suspicions grew as they examined her behavior and responses. Wendy's reaction to the 911 call, her call history, and her ambiguous statements about her whereabouts all pointed to a level of involvement far greater than mere knowledge of the crime. It seemed more likely that Wendy had been an active participant in the planning or execution of the murder, but proving her involvement would be a complex challenge. Wendy's calculated demeanor suggested she was no stranger to handling difficult situations, but the detectives were determined to uncover the truth. It was clear now that Wendy Adon wasn't just a passive ex-wife or a grieving mother. Her role in the murder of Dan Marel needed to be examined further. The police were beginning to suspect that she had played a central role in orchestrating the events that led to Marel's death, but they needed concrete evidence to take their suspicions further. The next step in the investigation would be to dig deeper into Wendy's financial history and the ties between her family and the hired hitmen. As the investigation continued, the chilling possibility that Wendy Adon had not only known about the murder but may have actively facilitated it became more likely. The detectives' instincts told them that Wendy wasn't just another victim of circumstance in this twisted tale of family betrayal. She was the key to unraveling the entire conspiracy. The key suspects: Luis Rivera and Sigfredo Garcia. As the investigation progressed, the focus shifted to the men who had carried out the murder: Luis Rivera and Sigfredo Garcia. The discovery of the rental car, a white Toyota Prius, linked both men to the scene of the crime and quickly made them central figures in the case. Initially, Rivera had denied knowing anything about the murder, claiming that he thought the trip to Tallahassee was just for a robbery, but as investigators dug deeper, it became clear that Rivera had more involvement in the plot than he had let on. Luis Rivera, a man with a criminal history, was brought into the conspiracy by Sigfredo Garcia, who was directly responsible for carrying out the murder. Rivera's initial involvement seemed simple enough. He was just the driver. Garcia had rented the car and driven the two men from South Florida to Tallahassee, where they would ultimately execute the plan. Rivera had no idea who the target was at first. Garcia had only told him that they were going to rob someone. But as they neared Tallahassee, Rivera learned the truth. They were hired to kill a man named Dan Marel. According to Rivera's account, Garcia convinced him to go along with the murder by offering him a $35,000 payment. Rivera, lured by the financial reward, agreed to assist, though he insisted he was only a driver and not a participant in the actual killing. Garcia, however, had other plans. He told Rivera that he needed him as backup in case something went wrong. When they arrived in Tallahassee, Garcia handed Rivera a gun, a .38 caliber revolver, and told him to be prepared for whatever happened. Rivera, however, refused to pull the trigger. His discomfort with the murder led him to stay in the car while Garcia went inside Marel's home and shot him. The murder itself was carried out swiftly and without hesitation. Garcia approached Marel's car, shot him in the head, and immediately fled the scene. Rivera, although present and complicit, did not participate directly in the killing. He remained in the car, waiting for Garcia to return. But even as the two men drove away, Rivera could not shake the realization that they had just killed an innocent man for money, someone with no connection to them, a victim of a plot orchestrated by Wendy Adon and her family. The crucial detail that emerged from Rivera's confession was his awareness of the financial motivations behind the murder. He learned that the murder had been ordered by Wendy Adon, Dan Marel's ex-wife, who was desperate to gain full custody of their children. Wendy had been in a bitter custody battle with Dan, and the prospect of eliminating him from their lives was too tempting for her to resist. Rivera's confession confirmed that the murder was not just about financial gain for the hitmen, it was deeply tied to the custody dispute and Wendy's desire for control. In the days following the murder, Garcia and Rivera returned to Florida, splitting the payment for the job. Rivera, initially unsure of the consequences, began to feel guilty about the murder. He realized that he had been part of a scheme far larger and darker than he had originally understood. He had been hired not for a robbery, but for a carefully orchestrated hit, and it was now clear that the people behind it Wendy Adon and her family were the ones pulling the strings. As Rivera came to terms with the gravity of his involvement, he began to cooperate with the authorities. In exchange for a reduced sentence, Rivera agreed to testify against Sigfredo Garcia and Catherine Magbanua. His confession became a key piece of evidence, providing investigators with the information they needed to link the Adon family to the crime. Sigfredo Garcia, upon being arrested, also admitted to his role in the murder. He confirmed that he had been hired by Catherine Magbanua, who acted as a liaison between the Adon family and the hitmen. Garcia's confession was crucial in confirming that Wendy Adon was at the center of the plot. She had been the one who initiated the plan, offering a financial reward to anyone who would kill her ex-husband. Garcia's role as the shooter and his cooperation with Rivera were vital in unraveling the conspiracy. Through their confessions, Garcia and Rivera not only admitted to their roles in the murder, but they also painted a disturbing picture of the familial motivations behind the killing. It was not just a random act of violence, it was a carefully planned and executed crime, driven by personal grievances, financial gain, and the desire for control. The confessions of Luis Rivera and Sigfredo Garcia were pivotal in cracking the case wide open. Their testimony provided the evidence needed to charge the Adon family members with conspiracy and murder. The involvement of Catherine Magbanua as the intermediary between the hitmen and the Adon family was confirmed, and the true motive behind the murder became clear. This was not a crime of passion, it was a cold, calculated act of revenge and manipulation. The role of Catherine Magbanua and the Adon family. Catherine Magbanua's involvement in Dan Marel's murder was pivotal, serving as the intermediary between the Adon family and the hired hitmen. Though Magbanua was not a direct member of the Adon family, her ties to Wendy Adon's brother, Charlie, and her relationship with Sigfredo Garcia placed her at the center of the conspiracy. Magbanua acted as the go-between, facilitating the communication and financial arrangements for the murder-for-hire plot. Her involvement, while not as visible as the hired killers, was essential in bringing the entire plan to fruition. It was through Magbanua that the murder was first set in motion. She had been in contact with Charlie Adon, who was deeply involved in the financial side of the plot. Charlie, along with Wendy, had orchestrated the plan to eliminate Dan Marel, driven by Wendy's desire to regain full custody of their children. According to Magbanua's testimony, she had discussed the details of the murder with Charlie, who confirmed that the job would be financially rewarding for the hitmen involved. Through these discussions, Magbanua understood that the murder was not just a crime for financial gain, but was also rooted in the Adon family's bitter custody dispute with Marel. Magbanua's involvement became even more pronounced when it was revealed that she had acted as the point of contact between the Adon family and Sigfredo Garcia, the hired hitman. She was responsible for passing along the payment information and ensuring the hitmen were paid once the job was completed. The investigation uncovered financial transactions and bank records linking Magbanua to payments made by the Adon family. These payments, funneled through the Adon Institute, a business controlled by Charlie and Wendy's mother Donna, served as the financial backbone of the murder plot. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Catherine Magbanua had been more than just a passive player in the conspiracy. She had actively facilitated the murder and had direct knowledge of the plot. Her relationship with the Adon family, especially her connection to Charlie, placed her in a position of trust within the conspiracy. The financial arrangements, the communication with the hitmen, and her role as the intermediary between the family and the killers painted a damning picture of her involvement. Magbanua's arrest and subsequent trial would be a crucial part of the investigation, as she stood at the crossroads of the Adon family's conspiracy and the hired killers. As authorities pieced together the financial records and communications, Magbanua's involvement was undeniable, and her testimony would be vital in linking the Adon family to the murder. The case of Dan Marel's murder exposed the dark side of family loyalty, revenge, and greed. Orchestrated by his ex-wife, Wendy Adon, and facilitated by her family, the crime was a chilling reminder of how far some will go for power and control. Though justice has been served with the convictions of the hitmen and key conspirators, the trial of Wendy Adon will determine the final accountability in this twisted saga. Ultimately, the true victims are Marel's children, who were left to grapple with the tragic consequences of a family consumed by betrayal and ambition.